Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address, should you like to shoot me a quick note with a comment or question or suggestion, is bam@catholicism.org. That's bam@catholicism.org. You can also contact me via Twitter. I'm at brother_Andre, and you can search for me on Facebook, Brother Andre Marie, and you will find me. This evening's episode is episode number 227. Why the Reform of the Reform is Doomed. And my guest is Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who recently authored an article by that very name. I simply, stole the name of his article, and thus will show my students by a negative example how plagiarism is a bad thing. And we're going to discuss the content of that article. I don't think that Dr. Kwasniewski needs an introduction to my audience. I will have, at any rate, on the Reconquest.net page for this show, a link to a bio of him so that you can learn more about him if you need to. He's authored multiple books, and I realized recently he's, I think, put final touches on a couple that he sent off to publishers. So without any further ado, we'll bring on Dr. Kwasniewski. Good evening, Dr. Kwasniewski.
Good evening, brother. It's great to be on the show again.
And it's good of you and gracious of you to take the time to join us. So I read your article, "Why the Reform of the Reform is Doomed," and I was duly impressed, and I thought you brought up a lot of good points, and I noticed that you've recapitulated a lot of themes that you've touched on in many of your other articles and books. But you've also touched upon an issue in addressing the reform of the reform that is timely, very timely in in more ways than one. I think more timely than you probably even knew when you were writing it. Mm-hmm. Given some things something that's happened in the interim, which we'll get to in a bit. But for the uninitiated, because not everybody's going to know what the reform of the reform is. Not every one of our listeners is going to know what this is right off the bat. So just for the uninitiated, could you just summarize what is meant by the reform of the reform?
Sure. No, that's a great question. It's really important to define this expression. So the reform of the reform, which is often abbreviated ROTR, is a movement, a loosely organized movement that dates to the middle 1990s, I think you could say. It was coined, that is, the phrase was coined by the German liturgist Monsignor Klaus Gamber in 1989. He's apparently the first one who ever used this expression. It was taken up by Joseph Ratzinger, which is why it became famous. It got mentioned, I believe it was in the preface to Dom Alcuin Reed's book on the organic development of the liturgy. And once Ratzinger noised it about, it was taken up by organizations like Adoremus in the United States, the Society for Catholic Liturgy, also in the United States, and some others around the world in different countries, especially European countries. Basically, the idea, it's very simple. The idea of the reform is, on the one hand, we are positive about Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy from Vatican II from 1963. We're positive about that. We think it had good content, that it laid out a modest and important, pastorally advantageous program of reform. But on the other hand, on the negative side, the Concilium, the body of scholars and bishops that was appointed to implement Sacrosanctum Concilium, they went off the rails. They got wild and crazy, and they did all kinds of things that were not justified by the council document and that have proven to be very harmful. So the reform of the reform movement is, let's go back to Sacrosanctum Concilium and the best ideals of the liturgical movement, and let us reform the reform. Let's somehow take the Novus Ordo, Missae, and the Liturgy of the Hours and all the other sacramental rites and blessings, and let us revise them in a direction of tradition, to make them more traditional, to make them more in continuity with Catholic tradition. So that's a summary of what it means. I guess I would just mention as a final point that its most famous current proponent is Cardinal Sarah of the Congregation for the Doctrine of, Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, and he has spoken out very strongly, for example, in favor of ad orientem, celebrating the Novus Ordo Mass eastward facing towards the apse, towards the altar, so that would be an example of a major point, ad orientem.
Okay, thank you. That was a very good, succinct summary of what the Reform of the Reform is. Now, in the beginning of your article, which of course will be linked to, it was on 1 Peter 5, and it will be linked to from the Reconquest.net page on this show. You point out what you consider the naivete of the advocates of the Reform of the Reform, although you don't use the word naivete, but I mean I think that's implied in the text. So why would you think that it's naive to advocate for the position that you just outlined?
Well, gosh, I mean, there are a lot of layers to this question. One layer, which I did not go into in the article, because after all, there's only so much you can go into in one article, and people will stop reading after a while if it gets too long. But one really huge problem here is just, how do we read Sacrosanctum Concilium itself? I mean, that document has loopholes big enough to drive a truck through, drive multiple trucks through. The
time bombs. Exactly, Michael Davis called them.
Right, and so in other words, or as Dennis McInerney recently pointed out in Latin Mass magazine, he said Sacrosanctum Concilium is written in a very strange way, because every time it says something traditional, practically the next paragraph says the opposite or opens up to the opposite. So Latin is to remain the language of the Roman Rite. However, Episcopal conferences can adapt the vernacular according to their own judgment. And so it doesn't actually give you clarity about where you're supposed to fall on many of these controversial questions. Gregorian chant should have pride of place in the Roman liturgy. However, this does not rule out other forms of music as long as they conform to the spirit of the liturgical action. So, and of course, these loopholes were taken advantage of immediately. I mean, the people who wrote these documents, Bugnini was the drafter, Annibale Bugnini was the drafter, one of the principal, let's say, organizers of the draft of Sacrosanctum Concilium. And as has been shown, in Yves Chiron's biography of him, he said to the people who wrote Sacrosanctum Concilium in private meetings, of which we have records, don't say too much because the bishops at the council won't vote for it. Just speak in generalities, leave enough wiggle room, and we'll take care of it after the council, Yeah. So they knew exactly what they wanted, and therefore the Reform of the Reform has the double problem of, first, they have to get into this wrangle and this fisticuffs about what does the document even mean, and secondly, they have to turn a blind eye to what we know was going on behind the scenes, what everybody wanted to come out of this. What they wanted to come out of it was what we got, not what the Reform of the Reform says. So that's one big problem. Another big problem is that the very Pope, without whom the Reform would never have happened, or certainly wouldn't have happened the way it happened, namely Paul VI, he was quite clear that he didn't want to see a sort of traditional Novus Ordo, by which I mean a Novus Ordo that's tridentinized, that looks somewhat like, or maybe even a lot like, the preconciliar liturgy. He didn't want that. He said very clearly in his audiences of November 1969, we have to say goodbye to the treasures of Gregorian chant and Latin. We have to say goodbye to the quiet, prayerful ceremonies that we're accustomed to. It's going to cause a many-sided inconvenience, and on and on and on. You know what I mean? So
yeah. So as a man who was in seminary in the early 90s, before the Reform of the Reform was codified as such, but we had all these conservative guys, and I was one of them in a seminary, and we'd get in fights with the liberals, and we would attempt to use Sacrosanctum Concilium to back up a traditional approach to the Mass. And of course, as you just pointed out, not in so many words, you're fighting with blunt weapons. You know, you quote the one I mean, I can explicitly remember a conversation I had with a quote unquote musician about Gregorian chant, and I quoted this thing from Sacrosanctum Concilium that you just touched upon, and of course he quotes the next paragraph or the next whatever, even phrase or clause in the same sentence. So yeah, that McInerney, Dennis McInerney, was it, pointed out.
Yes.
So this is, and by the way, I think Dennis McInerney was actually at Holy Apostles when I was there having this conversation. So he wasn't there, but I mean, these conversations, I imagine, have gone on for decades.
They have,
and they've got the conservatives fighting with blunt weapons.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you get into the. Well, I mean, as I said, there are many layers to this. I mean, in my opinion, the reform of the reform has three different levels of problems. It's awkward, it's improbable, and it's harmful. Okay, so why don't we take those up?
So these are the three. Are these the three? Is that your summary of your own three reasons that you gave? Fairly early on in the article.
I'm not following exactly
not
what
per
I said.
Se. Okay.
I'm just coming up with a sort of handy way of thinking about the question.
Okay.
And going from sort of the least problem to the biggest problem. So the least problem is that it's awkward. And what I mean by that is, I borrow this, I give credit to Joseph Shaw for coming up with this expression. He says that the reform of the reform Novus Ordo, so that would be like a Latin chanted ad orientem, incense-filled, Novus Ordo liturgy.
Yes.
It falls between two stools because, on the one hand, it's likely to displease trads. That is, Catholics who already know the traditional Mass and they know all the stuff that goes with it, the ceremonial and the texts. They're going to see a lot of that missing, even in a smells and bells, very high Novus Ordo Mass. And so it's going to bother them. It's going to be like an abridged version of a famous novel. Like, oh, I thought I was getting War and Peace. Where are the other 700 pages?
Yeah.
So it's to the trads, it won't satisfy them. It can never be traditional enough because it's a rupture. I mean, in its nature, we can get into that later. But on the other hand, the poor, Joe and Jane Catholic who've never seen anything other than the vernacular versus populum, jamboree kind of liturgy, they're going to be totally put off and alienated by this. I can't understand what he's saying. Why has he got his back turned to me? I'm allergic to incense. I don't like this dirge-like chant, whatever. So it falls between two stools. It's not traditional enough for some. It's way too traditional for others.
This is exactly. When I was reading that, because you make that point, you quoted Dr. Shaw in your article, and I laughed because I'm picturing a guy in an English pub who's had kicked down a few too many pints. But when you're describing this falling between the two stools thing, I experienced that myself personally at my grandmother's funeral, because the wonderful Archbishop of New Orleans refused to allow permission for her to have a traditional Mass funeral. This was before Summorum Pontificum came out, and I was terribly disappointed. My parents were terribly disappointed. So the priest, who was a kind of a friend of the family, offered a Latin Novus Ordo, very, very sort of, smells and bells, high church, if you will, and exactly what you described happened. I wasn't satisfied. My parents weren't satisfied. And we actually had somebody, a former teacher of mine, an old teacher of mine, who had the poor taste to accost us after the Mass with, why Latin? Why all this chant? Why did the priest turn his back to us? So it was, the liturgy wars of the 1970s and 60s sort of all over again, only kind of on the tail end of it in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, let me just say that the Novus Ordo was designed to be easy and simple for people, right? It was designed for quick accessibility You're supposed to hear in your own language what's being said and grasp it instantly. You can see that in Paul VI and other liturgical reformers. And so when you traditionalize it, it loses those goods for which it was made, even if it was a mistake to prioritize those goods, right? And to make them the be all and end all of the liturgy. The point is they are goods of a certain kind, and that's what people expect, and that's what it was designed for, right? So I've noticed that there's way more confusion at a Latin Novus Ordo than there is at a Tridentine Mass, because at a Tridentine Mass, first of all, there's so much silence that people just, even if they're not very familiar with it, they just think, oh, I guess I'm just supposed to kneel here and pray, and do something.
Imagine that. Yeah.
I'm just going to look around. Maybe I'll look at the stained glass. I'll say a few Our Fathers and Hail Marys. But in other words, it kind of invites you to pray. And other people might be familiar already with how to use a missal, because it's very common to have missals or missalettes at the traditional Latin Mass. But at the Latin Novus Ordo, nobody knows what's going on, and it's hard to cure that. The thing is, I'm talking from experience. I did this for 30 years. I tried to traditionalize the Novus Ordo. I was a Reformed person, 100%. So nobody can accuse me of not knowing what I'm talking about. I tried to do everything, all of this stuff. And I consistently saw that it was an uphill battle. It was like Sisyphus, pushing that rock uphill, and always it rolled back. It always rolled back. The moment the priest changed, the moment the bishop changed, the moment the congregation changed, anything changed, it was a disaster, because it was so not designed for that, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So you're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie interviewing Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. We're talking about why the reform of the reform is doomed. So you said that it was awkward, that I know.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So that's the first level of problem. The second level of problem is that it's improbable. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have ideal circumstances. You've got a congregation of the faithful who are interested in, or open to, or at least not objecting to, traditional Catholic worship. And you've got a priest, he's fresh out of seminary, he's just been ordained, he's completely gung-ho for all of these traditional things. And so he starts to implement them, and he catechizes and does ad orientem, and then he catechizes some more and puts things into Gregorian chant. And, it's happened over and over and over again. It's almost certain that there's going to be some cranky person in that parish who's going to complain. They're going to complain to him, they'll complain to their friends, they'll complain to the bishop, they'll call up the chancery, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And although there are times when, there are happy endings, there are times when bishops defend their priests and whatever, it also happens very regularly that the priest gets chewed out. Yeah. He gets told to cut it out. He's reassigned. Maybe he's sent for psychiatric evaluation. He's assigned to hospital chaplaincy, whatever happens, And we've all heard about these tragic cases, like Absolutely. The priest in Saginaw. And so it's improbable that so much a culture of liturgical superficiality and banality and mediocrity, which is what we've been dealing with for 50 years, okay, that's going to be able to be bumped or budged in most dioceses and in most parishes. So it's a really improbable event. Plus, the Vatican, after Benedict XVI's abdication, Benedict XVI was kind of Mr. Reform of the Reform, or maybe I should say Father Reform of the Reform. I mean, he kind of embodied the spirit of celebrating the new Mass in a traditional manner. And when he abdicated, Pope Francis, Jesuit, South American Jesuit, has no interest whatsoever in that kind of stuff. And, he celebrates the most unremarkable, untraditional looking Novus Ordo that you can imagine. And he and the Vatican have been extremely hostile to this Reform of the Reform movement. Everybody remembers what Father Hunnick calls Sarah-gate, which is
yes.
When Cardinal Sarah gave a lecture at the London Sacra Liturgia conference a few years ago, and he made an impassioned, beautiful, eloquent, theologically well-informed plea to priests to start celebrating the Mass ad orientem, and he got slapped down. I mean, it was within, I want to say 24 or 48 hours, he got a mega embarrassing slap down from the Vatican on that. And then, of course, finally, you have bishops. Bishops are towing the line of mediocrity. They're afraid of change. They're afraid of the traditionalist movement and of capitulating.
And of capitulating. So, are we? Did we lose a connection?
I'm still here.
Okay, so I heard a little glitch.
It sounded like somebody was shooting a gun.
oh, sorry. I don't know what happened. It was something weird happened. Okay, so you said they were afraid of capitulating. It sounds like maybe you felt threatened when you said capitulate.
Well, what I mean by that is like the Bishop of Boise. I mean, all of this stuff is very, very topical. It's all in the news. The Bishop of Boise, what was it, last week or no, more than that, a few weeks ago, he issued a memorandum to his clergy, which made big waves on the internet, telling them all, don't do ad orientem. Report to me if you're going to do the extraordinary form. Don't use kneelers for communion, and on and on and on. It was basically an anti-reform of the Reform manifesto, right?
Yeah, and this is what you said about Sarrogate. I mean, the audience needs to appreciate what this implies. This isn't just some random bishop or even some random cardinal giving his opinions on the liturgy to be later contradicted by the Vatican. This is the man who's in charge of the dicastery, whose competence is the sacred liturgy.
Yeah, right.
So he's the Pope's liturgy man, and he says this. He makes, as you say, this impassioned and eloquent and theologically informed plea, only to get shot down and have the rug pulled from under him.
Yes, exactly. So, if that wasn't enough, right, that it's awkward to do this, falls between two stools, and it's improbable, it's up against huge odds, right? There's the deepest level, and the one that is, finally speaking, all by itself, a reason why the reform is doomed, and that is that it's harmful. It's harmful to the priests, especially, and it's harmful to the people. So let me explain why that's the case. It's the basic problem with the Novus Ordo has a lot of problems, but one of the most essential problems with it is that it leaves so much undetermined. So much is up in the air at the discretion of the choice of the priest or the parish liturgy committee or the diocesan liturgy committee or whoever calls the shots. Mm-hmm. It's a modular liturgy. It's like building a liturgy out of Lego bricks. It gives you a certain selection of colors and bricks, and you build it yourself. And I mean by bricks, I don't mean like exactly what happens when, but how it happens. Is it going to be solemn or is it going to be casual? Is it going to be with chant or with guitar music? Is it going to be versus populum or ad orientem? Is the canon going to be read? Is it going to be the Roman canon or is it going to be the Eucharistic prayer for reconciliation? I mean, it has actually a mathematician friend of mine calculated. If you lay out all of the options at every single moment in the Novus Ordo from the beginning, where you can do an entrance hymn or an introit chant or nothing or read it out of the book, blah, blah, blah. If you take every moment in the rite and 3 different penitential rites and 8 or 10 different Eucharistic prayers, if you take all of those possibilities and multiply them, you get into the trillions of possible combinations.
Wow, this is like the national debt.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. And so it's a liturgy. It's a kind of do-it-yourself liturgy, and therefore, a priest who does a super reverent, traditionalized Novus Ordo, that's as much a product of his choices as a clown mass or a suburban talk show or whatever other possible Novus Ordo there could be. It's, instead of worship being an inherited given that is sort of armor-plated with rubrics, like you have to do it this way to be maximally reverent so that everybody knows that we are worshiping Almighty God, it's a deliberate exercise of the priest's will towards the liturgy. So the liturgy is sort of the clay in his hands, and he's the potter shaping it. Instead of it being the other way around, the liturgy is supposed to be the potter, and we're supposed to be the clay. We say to the Mass, shape me, make me like yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And with the Novus Ordo, it's like raw material, and you have to shape it, right?
Now this is this point you bring up in your article, and you you back this point up with a very eloquent comment from a seminarian correspondent friend of yours, which I'd like to read. He says, I assume he's in a diocesan seminary or something, so he's referring to himself in a sort of a Novus Ordo environment.
Yes.
While we're out there actively trying to conform the Novus Ordo to tradition, these guys, and he's referencing the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, etc., other traditional seminarians, these guys are simply letting the tradition form them. Seen that way, the Novus Ordo restorationist, no matter how closely he adheres to traditional beliefs and practices, is still engaged in a self-contradictory project. To be truly traditional, one has to become smaller and smaller. To conform the Novus Ordo to tradition, one has to become bigger and bigger. I think I read that like 5 times just to let it sink in. I think it's, I mean, this guy's obviously got brains, but aside from that, I think it speaks to the problem, because it's a matter of you're conforming the liturgy to your will if you want to make it traditional when it's the Novus Ordo. And you're in a way, it's like a pianist playing a cheap piano. He's fighting the piano as he's going. I once saw a great Russian pianist slap a Steinway piano at the end of the concert because he was fighting it the whole time. There was something wrong with it. But when you've got, if you've got the perfect, like perfectly built Bosendorfer, piano, and everything's perfect on it, it's conforming to what you want. I mean, you don't have to fight it. You're not fighting it. You're letting it do what it does. And I mean, I know it's an imperfect comparison, but
and the thing about that comparison, I mean, what you say is true, but it's something even in a way it's even worse, because the liturgy, although you might think of it as something static, right? It's a bunch of printed books. We follow the rubrics. We read the black. We say the black and do the red. The liturgy is a living heritage of prayer that all of the saints prayed before our time, and that they are now praying the fulfillment of that liturgy in heaven. I mean, when we say the earthly liturgy is a participation in the heavenly liturgy, it's not just this kind of pious platitude. The saints who were formed by the church's liturgy on earth are now rejoicing in the fullness of the meaning of that liturgy in heaven. And when we plug ourselves into the liturgical tradition, we're plugging ourselves into century after century after century of the life and prayer and asceticism and mysticism of the church. And in fact, there's a medieval saint, Saint Mechthild of Hockeborn, I think it is, who she says in one of her books, or actually, I'm sorry, Jesus says to her in one of her visions, he says, when you pray the prayers of the liturgy, the whole of heaven rejoices to hear the same words that they themselves prayed on earth. And the prayers are more powerful because the more people have prayed them, right? And I think, I've talked to priests who've had this kind of visceral experience with the Roman canon in Latin when they learned to celebrate the traditional Mass. And they got into, they finished the Sanctus, and then they began that Te igitur clementissime pater. Yeah. And they're saying that it's like this, you suddenly realize I'm entering into this awesome heritage that thousands and thousands and thousands of priests before me have prayed in exactly the same way, right? So it's more like, the comparison that comes to my mind is more like this. If you want to become a monk, and you want to become a holy monk, then you join a monastery. When you join the monastery, you have the humble attitude of, I'm joining this community that already exists, and what the abbot or the prior tells me to do, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to go in there and say, well, here's how I think it should be done, and I think we should do this, this, and this. No, you're the beginner. You shut up and you do what you're told. And
you don't set up a novice committee to change everything.
Right, exactly. And the Novus Ordo is just the opposite. It's I come in and I tell the liturgy how it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Is it supposed to be a clown mass? Okay, maybe in Germany that's what they want it to be. Is it supposed to be something like beautiful smells and bells with Gregorian chant? Well, then we decide that that's the way it's supposed to be. We decide, and it's John the Baptist, right? He must increase, I must decrease. I remember when I meditated on that years ago, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. That's the traditional liturgy, that Christ, through that liturgy, he grows in me and I decrease. I'm on the receiving end, and I let myself be shaped by it. With the motto of the Novus Ordo would be, it must decrease and I must increase, right? That is, its options have to go away and I have to increase my hold on it and my volition, right? Otherwise it's going to get completely out of control and it's going to become crazy.
And I've heard, and I'm sure you have heard as many or more than I, priests talk about when they learn the traditional Mass and begin to say it, it becomes habitual. They say, this is the first time I actually prayed the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
a lot of attention has been given in the literature to how the priest's own personal spirituality as a priest is enhanced, and how he also, not just personally, but as a sacred minister of the Church, is enhanced in his role because he disappears and enters into the alter Christus and is in persona Christi in a way that's more real to him than when he's doing the Novus Ordo, and just he's in this active role instead of passively receiving the liturgy. He's actively imposing himself upon it. But there's also something for the lay faithful too, because you and I don't experience the Mass as priests. We experience it as the Christ's faithful who are assisting at the Mass. But for us in the traditional rite, we too don't have to wonder about, well, how am I going to posture myself in this Mass? How am I going to react to what Father Bob does? When he tells everybody to stand up and stretch out and hold hands at the Our Father, or takes any of those freaky options that he has to do. How do I react to this? You don't have to. You know what you're going to do. And it's not like variety is the spice of life. It's not. Right.
No, it's exactly right. It's I've talked about this a lot under the aspect of Lectio Divina. If you're praying with the Bible, the reason why you can get a long ways with Lectio Divina, or I should say, you can get a long way with Lectio Divina if you take a text that remains stable. It's always the same in front of you, and you slowly assimilate it, and you repeat it over and over again. So in a way, the precondition for deep prayer is that the object of your prayer has to be stable and fixed, so that you can kind of hover around it, and you can, as we're saying, you can let it determine you. You can let it shape you. And the traditional liturgy is very much like Lectio Divina in that respect. It's not a moving target. So for the lay people, we always know what we're going to get, right? You just know what you're going to get. It's always the same. I mean, there are little differences, like, okay, the color of the vestment's different, or this priest speaks louder and that priest speaks, sure, there are little really accidental differences, but the essence of the thing is always the same. And as a result, can you imagine trying to compete in archery if somebody's moving the target around? Like, you've got the target on the back of a pickup truck, right? And somebody's just driving back and forth. You're never going to hit that thing except by luck, right? If you want to hit it, it's got to stay exactly where it is. And that's really very much the profound wisdom of the liturgical tradition, is to give us a kind of, in a way, it's finite. It's a finite, determined, predictable, comprehensible body that opens onto the infinite and the incomprehensible. And it's magic. The progressives would hate me for saying that, but it works. It's an amazing thing when you actually experience it.
Now, and by the way, it's the difference between, to take your Lectio Divina comparison and to take it into a similar domain, the difference between meditation and contemplation. Meditation, you're sort of mastering the material, but in contemplation, the material masters you. The object that you're contemplating seizes you, and there's something therefore more inherently contemplative in the nature of the traditional masses compared to the Novus Ordo.
Yes, that's right. And then, just to continue going with this idea of the harmfulness of the reform of the reform, it keeps the integral good of the traditional Latin Mass away from the priest and the people. So, and this is just kind of building on the comments that we're already making. it kind of throws a bone to, I mean, all of us desire the smells and bells. We all want to have beautiful liturgy. What most Catholics don't realize, because we're just our catechesis is so poor and our exposure to the liturgy is so flimsy in a way, what most Catholics don't realize is just the riches that are there in the liturgical texts themselves. And so if you get the high Novus Ordo with the incense and that chant and whatever, it can sort of, in a way, it can satisfy you at a surface level, like, this is great. It looks like Mass. It feels like Mass. Hallelujah. Nobody here is playing bongo drums. It's great. But they don't realize, the prayers at the foot of the altar are gone. The Confiteor has been gutted.
Yeah.
The offertory prayers are gone. The three priestly prayers before communion, those are gone too. The last gospel is gone. All this stuff is gone, and even some scripture readings. We've talked about this in another episode, but some scripture, St. Paul warning about unworthy communion, that's gone too. All kinds of stuff is gone in the Novus Ordo. But if you don't go to the traditional Latin Mass, you'll never get it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And therefore, if a priest wants to be formed the way that nearly 2,000 years of people were formed, okay, we know that the liturgy developed, but in so many respects it remains stable for 1,000 years or more. If they want to get that heritage, then that pre-modern heritage, and in some ways anti-modern heritage, then they need to get it from the pure, unadulterated source, right? So the reform of the Reform keeps people away from that. It gives them a lesser good, which is still a good, but it gives them a lesser good, and it cuts them off from growing even deeper roots into the tradition of the church.
So this is why you say in your article that it's prolonging the agony of the church, because it's giving people, it's slaking their thirst a little bit, but not sufficiently. And that's my comparison. Right. But you did say it's prolonging the agony, and I thought that was a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it's kind of, you could either say it's not giving people enough to eat and drink, or maybe if you wanted to use a different scriptural image, you can say it's giving people water, but not wine, or something like that. In a way, really what we're just saying is it perpetuates the myth of continuity, right? It's a way of showing through externals, hey, this is still the same liturgy, when it's not the same liturgy. And so, and at many other levels, right? It's the ceremonial, that is the rubrics about the gestures and actions, is radically different between the two, no matter how much you dress it up. What the scholars call the euchological content, that is to say the content of the prayers, the orations, the collect, secret, post-communion, the preface, these things, right, are very different. Only 17%, to bring up a famous figure, only 17% of the euchological content of the old missal made its way unchanged into the Novus Ordo.
Yeah. Now, I'm sorry. No, finish your point. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. That's all I was going to say.
Okay, but if we take that we had this alteration of the propers, and we have this 17% figure, and by the way, it's not like the quality was enhanced in the other. What is it, 83%? There was a significant lowering of the quality, but and Father Anthony Cicada, who we wouldn't agree with on the Sedevacantist question, wrote I think a momentous book on this when he talked about the problems of the prayers of the new Mass. But there was a priest that you probably know. I've met him, a wonderful man, Father Thomas KOCIK, who literally wrote the book on the Reform of the Reform. He wrote a book called The Reform of the Reform, a Liturgical Debate, published by Ignatius Press in 2003. Now, Father KOCIK had what Father Richard Chipola called a Tract 90 moment, when he did a volte-face, and he realized basically, and he put it in much more delicate language than I would, and I think than you would, because he was being very diplomatic in the way he stated his case. But he basically said this is fruitless. And it went from being a reform of the reformer to being a trad, an integralist, if you will, liturgically. Now, he points out that this is an insurmountable obstacle, these prayers. He wrote an article that's published on the New Liturgical Movement website, which is actually kind of a Reform of the Reform kind of site. And they let him critique the reform of the reform on that site.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
and that's one of the points he brings up is this all of these property. This is an insurmountable obstacle that all of
Yes.
that was changed. This is not, and he said it. He's obviously a humble man. He's a scholarly man. He read through a bunch of books that were published by heavyweight scholars, and went from the position of reform of the reform to saying, no, this is impossible. It's a fruitless task because the changes do not represent organic development in the liturgy.
Right.
This was a rupture, and there's no continuity.
Yes. Well, and in fact, I would say, okay, well, there are a lot of different ways that people find themselves or end up at the traditional Latin Mass. Some people go there just because it's reverent and they can adore the Lord and they can actually pray. And that's completely a worthy reason to go, right? Maybe, and such a person might never come to see some of the textual issues, or they're not going to come to see them right away. They will eventually see them if they pay attention. But there are people who go just because they literally cannot find a reverent Mass anywhere else in their diocese. There are other people who go for the liturgical music, for this beautiful sacred music, right? But there are, I think, maybe more intellectual types, who enjoy reading and who want to see, like, what are we praying at Mass? I want to pray with that some more. I want to think about it. Those people, when they get to that level and they really start doing close comparisons of the texts, then it's like the scales fall off and it's all over. It's Waterloo. The Novus Ordo has lost the battle.
Yeah. When you look at the collect, say, for the feast of Saint Thomas à Becket in the Novus Ordo and compare it to the traditional Mass, we've lost so much, and he's not the only one. So many, especially these
Saint
saints.
Joseph. It's Saint Joseph of Cupertino, Saint Robert Bellarmine, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the Presentation of the Virgin Mary, the Feast of Christ the King. You've probably seen. I've done a lot of studies of these things.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable. I wouldn't have believed. This is part of the problem, is that non-traditionalists, looking on the outside, they can't believe that what we're saying could be true.
Yeah.
I remember, because I was once on the outside too. I was thinking, oh man, these traditionalists, they must be exaggerating. They're talking about how it's like radically different. Well, the priest still goes up to the altar. He still says the words of consecration. What's the big deal, right?
Yeah.
But once you get into the weeds, then you realize, oh my goodness, this is a radically different liturgy. And
when you look at the St. Catherine of Siena prayer, what they took out, it's like the red letter, it's like the Jefferson Bible of collects for Saint.
Exactly.
They literally took out the miracle. No, we can't have that stuff. That's too fantastic.
Yeah. No, the miraculous elements were stripped out systematically. The mention of conversion of non-Catholics was stripped out systematically. The mention of asceticism, despising the worldly goods and longing for heavenly goods, that was expunged. So there were multiple filters that were applied, right, to just get rid of anything that was deemed not to fit with the modern spirit.
Yeah,
that's what we're dealing with, and that you cannot solve by reform of the reform. You cannot solve that from within the Novus Ordo. Let me give you a metaphor. Everybody who's handled raw meat knows how greasy and clumpy it is, right? If I had a mixture from the store of 83% pork and 17% beef, and they had given that to me, it was all mixed already, and said, okay, here's your meat for your hamburgers, right, or for your meatballs or whatever. Am I going to take that mixed meat home and say, okay, I'm going to now take out the 83% and try to get all the
just the beef.
All beef. I want all beef, right? I'm going to take this mixed meat and I'm going to get it. No, you can't do that. It's impossible. It's so mixed in that what you have. This is what Father KOCIK was saying. You have to just start over. You say, I'm sorry, I don't like this completely redacted missal. It was redacted with ideological principles, which have been demonstrated to be the case, and I want the tradition of the saints. That's what I want. Boom.
Yeah.
That's it. Start over again with the healthy missal, and then you're good to go.
That's definitive. That's a definitive. I don't want this redacted thing that was redacted along ideological lines, and by the way, it was a false ideology. And I want to start with the real thing, not to have to sanitize something that's already been messed up.
Exactly, and sanitize it by my own continual effort, right? Of that. So one of the things I said in the article is a successful Novus Ordo Mass, and by successful I mean a successful reform of the Reform Novus Ordo Mass.
Yes,
is the personal conquest of the liturgical team that puts it on, right?
Yeah.
That is to say, they can all slap each other on the back and say, "Fantastic job! We just rescued the Novus Ordo from itself," right? and what happens after a traditional Latin Mass? Okay, fine. Sometimes you have a big group picture and people are happy, but they're not happy because because they made the liturgy what it was. Maybe they're happy because it was a 2-hour pontifical liturgy. It was very complicated and everything went smoothly. Fine, but that's a normal sort of human happiness. But they're not happy that they made the liturgy what it was. The liturgy just is what it is, and they sweated themselves to death to get it just right, according to what it is, right?
Yeah.
And so they can't pat themselves on the back and say, you made that work. No, it made it work.
And our Eastern Christian brethren would say, yeah, that's what we do. I mean, because they don't do the liturgy. The liturgy does them. I mean, they enter into it. So you're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie interviewing Dr. Peter Kwasniewski on why the reform of the Reform is doomed. Now, Doctor, I'd like to shift gears a little bit, if you don't mind, because we have...
Could I just mention one last thing?
Sure.
Just very briefly. Finally, I just want to say that, all the good priests out there, and again, I was of this mindset for many years. There are lots of good priests out there who are trying to reintroduce actual Tridentine elements into the Novus Ordo. So they do prayers at the foot of the altar when they're coming from the sacristy, if their church is big enough. They might whisper the last gospel on the way out. They will actually whisper some of the prayers of the old prayers of offertory when nobody's looking, while the singing is going on during the offertory. They'll hold the canonical digits, right, the thumb and the forefinger together until the emotions. I've seen all this stuff done in the Novus Ordo. Okay, the problem with it is most of that, maybe even all of that, is technically illegal, is illicit. You're not supposed to change liturgical rites.
Yeah.
And so what they're doing is fighting one abuse, namely Paul VI's papal abuse of power, his papal overreach on the liturgy, by another abuse, namely their own arbitrary enrichments of it with Tridentine elements.
Back in the day, Notitia said that was forbidden because you were rite mixing.
Yeah, well, and however you want to look at it, it's still fighting one abuse with another abuse.
Yeah.
It's fighting one arbitrariness with another arbitrariness. So that's why I think this is harmful. Okay.
Thank you for the excellent point. Now, just shifting gears quickly. In the meantime, since you've written this article, has come out the news that the CDF, who did not consult Section 4 of the CDF, which is the old Ecclesia Dei Commission people who have competence over the traditional liturgy, they did not consult them. So this is at a higher level of CDF. Possibly they were instructed directly by the Holy Father, but they sent a questionnaire with a cover letter out to all of the international episcopacy, the entire Catholic episcopate, or at least the diocesan ordinaries, and it's a questionnaire with 9 questions about the reception of Summorum Pontificum, and this is 13 years after the fact. Benedict XVI did a sort of a 3-year questionnaire after it was out for 3 years to see how it was received. But everyone's saying, this doesn't look good. Now, there are 2 points, there are 2 questions in this questionnaire, which I think, and by the way, I'm going to link from the reconquest.net page to the news items on this so that you can find out what I'm talking about if you're not aware, listeners. But there are 2 questions which I think are ad rem to this subject of the reform of the Reform. And number 5 is, does it occur to you that in your diocese, the ordinary form has adopted elements of the extraordinary form? Now, that is the reform of the Reform. And question 8, which is only tangentially related, is: has the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum had an influence on the life of seminaries, the seminary of the diocese, and other houses? Houses of formation. So they didn't edit it properly before it was leaked. So the question I have for you is: does this look like another instance of falling between the stools? You and I aren't happy with the reform of the reform. Well, it looks like the progressivists running the show aren't happy with it either. And this could be an instance of saying, well, look, they've introduced the traditional stuff into the seminaries. It's ruining our reform. Not only that, but even the liturgical praxis of the priests and the parishes is being sort of garbled and hybridized by these guys who are throwing in all this antiquated stuff into the liturgy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to interpret why the Vatican does certain, make certain moves. I mean, this could theoretically be a harmless questionnaire. It's been 10 years since the last time there was a questionnaire. That's a pretty good chunk of time. The Vatican just made what most people interpret as a positive move with these CDF decrees that in a certain sense brought the 1962 Missal up to the present as far as saints are concerned, but we won't have to go to the details there. But there really doesn't seem to be much evidence that the Vatican wants to try to put the axe to Summorum Pontificum or to the traditional Mass or anything like that. On the other hand, the questions are pretty ominous in their tone. I mean, they sound like they were written by somebody who's trying to get the goods, trying to find out how Summorum Pontificum is having a too powerful an effect on young clergy, and as you said, kind of mingling traditional elements in with the reform mentality, which is very untraditional in its mentality. So yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, the Bishop of Boise, he could have written these questions, right? They're just the kind of things that he's talking about. We don't want the mutual enrichment to occur in that direction. We don't want elements coming over from pre-conciliar Catholicism to infect, as they would see it, post-conciliar Catholicism, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's how I read it. Now, Rorate Celli today came out with a more ominous thing because whoever leaked this thing to them gave them further information, and it's been told to them that this is definitely a hatchet job on the traditional Mass. Now, obviously, this is not, this is one man's opinion. That's how he's reading the tea leaves in the Holy See, but
right.
And he's anonymous, so we don't know, but.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, Vatican, they talk about Vaticanistas, journalists specialize in Vatican affairs. They've been wrong probably about 50% of the time.
Yeah. It's like the guy that goes into the conclave as a pope and comes out as a cardinal, right?
Indeed.
So now in your article towards the end, and we have about 2 minutes left, but in the article towards the end, you make a beautiful comparison of the reform of the reformer, sort of ditching this false, this contrived via media between tradition and novelty, let's say. You compare this to Newman's realization that High Church Anglicanism is simply not a viable via media between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Revolt, even in its Anglican schismatic form. And you're not the first person to make this comparison. Father Richard Cipolla made the comparison comparing Father Thomas KOCIK's move to and he's the one that called it the Newman Tract 90 moment. But you also go beautifully. You point out that Richard Crashaw, the wonderful metaphysical poet, who converted to Catholicism, came to that same conclusion that this is a 17th century man, obviously a very sensitive soul, beautiful poetry, influenced by the way by the Jesuit saint Robert Southwell, but he realized that there is no via media between the Catholic Church and the Anglican schism. You have to accept the one or the other, and you draw an analogy between that and the reform of the reform as the via media between tradition and novelty. I just want to say I thought that was a beautiful comparison.
Yeah, thank you. It does seem to me that Newman has so much to teach us about all of these things. And one of the particular points is that the Anglican Church was already 300 years old when Newman left it, and called it the veriest of non-entities, right? And what the point I wanted to make there was, sometimes you have people say, "Oh, quit calling it the new Mass. It's already 50 years old. It's already part of Catholic tradition." I want to say, look, something that was erroneous, something that should not have happened, it doesn't become Catholic no matter how many centuries pass, right?
Yeah.
And that's the case with Protestantism, with Anglicanism. It's going to be the case with the Novus Ordo. It doesn't matter how long it's around. It's still a mechanistic rupture, an artifice, an ideologically driven committee product. That's what it is. That's what it will always be. So what we need to do is always recover and restore Catholic tradition. That's what we need to do.
Great. Well, that's a good closing point because we've run out of time, Doctor. But thank you so much for joining me. I think it was an insightful discussion. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You've been listening to Recognize on the Crusade Premium Channel. God bless and Mary keep you.